The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm Charles Christian, and thank you very much for tuning in again. This week we're all cryptozoology, as our main event is an interview with Matt Salusbury, a UK-based writer, journalist, teacher and trade union organiser. My union, the National Union of Journalists, in case you were wondering. Matt is a regular contributor to the Fortean Times magazine here in the UK on the subject of mysterious animals, cryptids and their associated folklore, and he also takes a particular interest in my part of the world, East Anglia. So let's get on with the interview with Matt. Matt, good to speak to you. As I was mentioning earlier, we have an English listenership, and I'm sure many of them will be familiar with things you've put in Fortean Times. But we've also got an American readership who aren't quite so familiar with your name. So, in a nutshell, what are the areas you write about?
I'm a sort of eclectic generalist. I seem to be doing a lot of cryptozoology. There's my book, Pygmy Elephants, which is about that, obviously. Mm-hmm. I've done a lot of history of science, paradigm shifts, for example, Ernst Chladni, who worked out that meteors did come from outer space. I've done some profiles of famous, slightly Fortean people. I'm probably best known for Trots in Space, which was an examination of the positists, who were a Trotskyite UFO cult who believed that UFOs were evidence of people from a perfect socialist future or socialist planet. Very, very strange branch of Trotskyism. It's still going. As I said, a little bit of everything. I've done archaeology recently, the background to Sutton Hoo, which was the most famous Anglo-Saxon burial site in England, and rumours about spiritualist seances, and was Dr. John Dee one of the grave robbers? So a little bit of everything, whatever takes my fancy, really.
You're currently working on a book about the mysterious animals of the British Isles, but the Suffolk edition.
Yeah, that's not Suffolk County, Virginia. That's Suffolk, east of England, one of the rural counties of the UK, which has less than 1 million human inhabitants, but a lot of strange animal inhabitants. Very quickly, that became an investigation into big cats, which hasn't really been handled by anybody in that county. Mm-hmm. And I get an extraordinary number of reports of big cats, including some recent exciting news that I can't talk about yet.
Oh.
But you'll hear about eventually. There's an awful lot that I can't talk about that I've heard, but may eventually reach the light of day.
And when we're talking about big cats, we're not just meaning big moggies that have wandered. We're talking about possible black panthers, pumas, or some kind of as yet unrecognised, undiscovered felines.
Well, there are a number of misidentifications of ordinary moggies that I've documented. People are very bad at telling the size of animals that they see a long way off, particularly if they're unusual-looking cats. We're struggling to fill the gaps. Our brain is struggling to fill the gaps in what we're seeing, and people often overestimate the size. But it seems that there are black leopards. People consistently describe what's a black leopard. And there seem to be a lot of pumas as well. And there are also local areas where there's a lot of lynxes. And there's good evidence that a lot of these are probably now the descendants of big cats that were kept in captivity and were let loose when the Dangerous Wild Animals Act came in around 1973. And there was somebody who wrote to the local paper, the East Anglian Daily Times, in 1997 claiming to have released a puma. But also there's the theory that something's happened to our feral cats. They're out there in the woods, and some of them have become really, really huge. You hear stories from people involved in cat rescue locally, domestic cat rescue, who get these huge, 3-foot long, including the tail cats that turn up in the woods. So it's probably a combination of those two. I mean, certainly there have been some very consistent reports of black leopards, pumas, lynxes. One or two big cats that don't match the description of any known big cat. Like there's this strange, like a lynx but long and thin, tufted ears but black, that was spotted on a golf course in a place near Ufford. Place called Ufford in the early 2000s. But there's often a very consistent pattern to the sightings. For example, a lot of taxi drivers, because I only recently learned to drive, so I was taking a lot of taxi rides around Suffolk. And a taxi driver would say, without me
prompting
broaching the topic myself, I saw a black leopard in 2012. And I say, well, that's interesting because I just interviewed somebody the other day who saw one in the same neighbourhood at that time. So there's a consistent pattern to sightings, so there's something going on. And there's also reports of kills, although the wildlife people who come across deer, it's usually deer, that have been eaten by something are very reluctant to say anything because all sorts of management and officialdom will get involved when there's a body. So I get a lot of off-the-record reports of kill signs.
But, I mean, lynxes, are they, excuse my ignorance, were they once native to the UK?
Yeah, they were native around about the Saxon times, about 800, when they disappeared. I think they probably disappeared from southern England earlier than that. We're not sure. Yeah, definitely. But I mean, there are fossil pumas from sort of 900,000 years ago, European pumas. But yes. Although recently there's been in Norfolk an archaeological site, which is a Roman villa that had a tile factory, and they left the tiles out to dry, and obviously some were thrown away into the rubbish heap when animals walked on them, and there's a footprint of what appears to be a serval, which is a sort of big wild cat, maybe twice the size of a domestic cat, long, thin, and with these pointy ears. So it seems that there's at least one likely example of the Romans domesticating or keeping as captives or curiosities or little menageries of some big wild cats. But would they have survived through historic time to now? It's unlikely.
Yeah. So what your view is, what people are encountering are descendants of captive animals that have been released in relatively recent times, the last 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah, that would make them the third or fourth generation. The earliest reports I've seen of a big cat in Suffolk is from Rendlesham Forest, which people might know from ufology, because that was the scene of the Boxing Day 1980 Rendlesham UFO incident.
Yes.
But because there's so much attention by all sorts of investigators, some fringe, some very fringe, and some much more down to earth, because they're poking around and talking to people around there, they gather also anecdotal stories of encounters with mystery animals, including some very strange ones. Animals which couldn't possibly exist, which are being reported. And the earliest I heard is 1974. A man driving through Rendlesham Forest at night, obviously very slowly because there's no lights there and it's quite remote, sees a black leopard bounding across the road. I've also heard from around the same time people who were foresters who had heard reports of be careful when you're working in those woods because there's big cats there.
Right.
But that would have been really, a year or two after people allegedly started releasing them. But also, this theory about something's happened to our feral cats and they've become gigantic, that's quite plausible. Don't forget that over the years there have been some very exotic genes in our domestic cats. There are Maine Coon cats, which get really huge, and some other exotics that are out there, sort of wild cats that could have been released. There are other cat-sized species of wild cat for which you need a license, like jungle cats or golden cats, which could conceivably and have been bred with domestic cats. It could be a combination of both. I've heard the theory that the descendants of these feral, gigantic wildcats could have got so big that they're breeding with the pumas or the leopards. I think that's a bit unlikely. Because a lot of these hybrids apparently are sterile.
Yes.
And that kind of fits in with a lot of sightings because you hear about a big cat in a particular neighborhood and then after a few years the reports cease, which suggests maybe they're dying without issue, as it were.
I've got you,
But increasingly I'm moving to the other more prosaic and less inspiring theory that people are just really bad at telling how big cats are when they see them. And I was called out by a farmer who saw something on his CCTV in infrared in this featureless yard with no background and very hard to tell the scale. So we did some running around the yard with some cardboard cutouts and filming that and doing overlays, and it was a small domestic cat, just a very odd-looking one. So it is very easy to do that. So I think the answer is somewhere between all three. The big problem with the idea of big cats in Britain is where's the roadkill?
Yeah.
Because there should be a lot of roadkill. And I've heard people describing driving along in the morning and seeing a body by the side of the road and coming back and it's gone, and all sorts of conspiracy theories. There was in Scotland, in Malaysia, there was, in about 2012, there was a young black leopard, like a cub that was almost adult. The body was found fallen off a cliff with seagulls in its stomach and it was rotting away. But you'd expect a lot more roadkill. For example, I saw a few years ago there was a paper, an ecology academic paper published about estimating the population of pumas in a particular state in the US based on the roadkill. Now, based on the roadkill, the population of the cats in the UK would be zero.
Right, yes.
Unless the population is so tiny that it's not possible to extrapolate from the statistics. But that's the major stumbling block. The other one, and particularly true around East Anglia, the other problem that you encounter when you start investigating big cats, particularly historically, is you've got Black Shuck, the phantom dog, supernatural phantom hound with all these powers who shrinks and disappears. There was a peak in sightings in the 1970s. And then when that wave stops, then you start seeing the big cats. And you do have to wonder whether there's some sort of psychocultural phenomenon going on that, for whatever reason, these sightings of black dogs became big cats.
Would that be publicity? It was going back to sort of 70s when you first started getting these Beast of Bodmin Moor and various type stories.
The Surrey Puma in the early 60s, and the Shooter's Hill Cheetah, which nobody remembers, that was around the same time.
Yeah.
I think, and also in looking at, I do get the occasional Black Shark report. Whenever you're investigating one animal, you get reports of another. And it's noticeable that the sort of special powers or phenomenal magical tricks attributed to Black Shark get less, like it gets more plausible. The things that it can do, while fantastic, are sort of within the realm of, you know, what people experience through technology. And I think also, you know, people were sort of, they see something strange and they try to sort of rationalize it as something within their experience, and whatever it was, maybe they're trying to rationalize what they've seen as a big cat because they're flesh and blood animals and they exist. I mean, this is some, you know, delving deep into mass psychology. Mm-hmm. But I just identify it as a problem in terms of the credibility of big cat reports, particularly in East Anglia.
Yeah. Sort of moving on from big cats, one of the other things I've seen you write about are mummified cats that are walled up in pubs and various other places. Again, quite a lot of them in East Anglia. Yeah,
well, I just covered them because there are lots of mummified cats in the UK. As you say, they were often buried, we think often alive, sometimes cats and kittens, sometimes cats with rats, in buildings to bring good luck and particularly to protect against fire. And they'd often be put in spaces in chimneys, or they'd be walled up in some way. And by coincidence, in West Suffolk, so that's the area around Bury St Edmunds, the cathedral city, going west towards Cambridgeshire and Essex. There's a cluster there which you can do in a day. I mean, you could even do it on the same. It's all on the same bus route, although buses are rather scarce and expect long waits. There's in Bury St Edmunds. There's one in the Moyses Hall Museum. Well, in fact, there are several, and they recently discovered a new one. I'm not sure whether that's on display yet, but they discovered a new one in the town. There's one on display with some rats, and they look like some sort of gremlins because the skin shrinks and they look sort of skeletal, but they've still got the skin on, so they look particularly creepy. And there's one in this pub called The Nutshell in Bury St Edmunds, which is famous for being allegedly the smallest pub in Britain.
Yes.
It's a small room, and it's well worth a visit. Although if you're a bit shy, don't bother, because you can't stay out of any conversations you might be drawn into because it's so small. They have the usual foreign banknotes hanging from the ceiling, but also a mummified cat.
Right.
Which if you ask nicely, they'll let you photograph, but do not touch it because there's a curse attached to it, allegedly. Right. And then in Clare, which was one of the wool towns in the 1490s, wool took off, and there was immense prosperity in that part of the world based on the wool trade, exporting wool to the continent. And it was a wool town, it's now a village. But in, not Clare, in Lavenham, which is one of these wool towns, an easy bus ride from Bury, probably best known internationally because of the De Vere House, which was the ancestral home of Harry Potter in Deathly Hallows Part 2, but was famous before that. There's the Guildhall, which is now a National Trust property, and there's an amazing mummified cat there. It goes by the name of Rameses, we think because the people who bought the Guildhall and restored it were a pair of eccentric twins, one of whom was a retired Egyptologist. Now, Ramesses is amazing, and he's worth the price of admission alone. He's still got some of his whiskers.
Oh, right, yeah.
And very well preserved. Been nibbled a bit, but still very well.
Yeah.
Still in a very good condition. And then if you go to Sudbury, which is on the border with Essex, a bit further down, was one of the wool towns, is still a town. If you go to the Mill Hotel and ask nicely at reception, they'll direct you to a section of the floor, and there's a little recess with a glass cover, and there's another mummified cat. The story goes that there was a fire after they were doing some restoration on the hotel in the 70s, and they took it away, and the place burned down. So in order to restore the good luck, they put it back in.
I've also heard people discovering, obviously, things like witch bottles, but also, horses' heads or horses' limbs as well, somewhere in the foundations or somewhere under the kitchen. Certainly not the place where such a creature would normally end up.
Yeah, there were several of these old Suffolk houses that were restored, and they found spaces deliberately built into the house when it was being constructed, usually by the chimney, where they put all these good luck objects. And the strangest one I heard is the bones of the wings of a goose with all sorts of notches in them, which they think is some kind of almanac for recording particular days or something. But yeah, they are quite common in the county.
Now, less common, but we've mentioned it, and it seems peculiar to East Anglia, is the Woodwose, which is really, I suppose, our version of Bigfoot or the Yeti.
Yeah, it's actually a very different animal and closer to humans. They're usually depicted as being like, it's usually men, although there are some wild women too. They're about human size. They're just covered in hair, but their faces are usually not covered in hair. They've got identifiable hair and beards. And they've got long sort of curly hair on their heads. These are found mostly in Suffolk, and nobody really knows why they're so common. And they're mostly in churches. They're found on the fonts, the baptismal fonts of churches when you come in. They're usually by the door, usually about a foot high, carved in stone. Now, there's no stone there, so the stone will have come from the wrong end of Cambridgeshire by river, or possibly from Normandy. And they're also found on the porches of some churches. Usually they're charging with a club and a shield, fighting a dragon or a wyvern, which is I'm not sure about the pronunciation. What wyvern, which is a dragon with two legs. And occasionally they appear on the tops, on the roof of churches, or on top of the spire. They were seen to have been built again in the wool boom, when there was a lot of churches being built around 1490. And as I say, they exist mostly as these images, and they seem to be very much in Suffolk, although I've been encountering more and more of them in Norfolk. There are sort of clusters around Norwich, and there's some of them scattered around Norfolk, and there's a few around the Cambridgeshire and Essex borders. Now, there are a couple of accounts of wild men being encountered. For example, there's a pub called The Wild Man in a place called Sproughton, which is just near Ipswich, probably best known for the British sugar factory, which is now closed. And it's said to have got its name because when it was being built, and again around that time of the 1490s, the wool boom, the builders were terrified by a wild man who appeared in some waste ground. And there's also an account from Ralph of Coggeshall, who's a chronicler. He was an abbot in Coggeshall in Essex, writing in the 13th century, and he described in the reign of King Henry II, so sometime before, that there was a man found in the sea off the coast of a town called Orford, which is a fishing village that has a castle. And this was a naked man with a bald patch and long straggly hair, who appeared to be human, and he would catch fish in his hands and sort of squash them and squeeze the juice into his mouth. And he was captured and put in the dungeon in the castle, and they made attempts to convert him to Christianity, which failed. And they would let him out in the river leading to the sea. They rig up these nets and allow him to swim between the nets, and he eventually escapes. So there are these encounters with wild man, and I've heard testimony of people who've seen something strange in modern times. There was a man walking in a place called Peasenhall, which is out in the sticks. He was walking back to his campsite one summer, and he saw in the corner of his vision this kind of vague, tall, hairy shape with an indistinct head. And he describes that more as a vision than, actually a flesh and blood animal that he saw. And there's also a report from a lorry driver in a place called, where was that? That was up by the border with Norfolk, around about the beginning of Thetford Forest. He was driving through a village, and he saw some kind of a grey, ape-like creature that ran on all fours next to his cab before disappearing into the foliage. But no one really knows. I've asked all the church architects and church historians what these wild men, these Woodwoses, are doing. Now, we call them Woodwose, which is an Anglo-Saxon word. It's nothing to do with the woods. We think Wooda, which is wild in Saxon, and Wose, which is being, or it's sometimes been translated as a troll or a goblin or something. And a lot of people think that because it's an Anglo-Saxon word, that there's this continuity of sightings and traditions going back to Anglo-Saxon times. But as far as I can work out, it was a word that Victorian antiquarians adopted, to show off their knowledge of ancient things. And in other countries, they're just called wild men.
Yes.
But my research recently has taken me to the south of Holland and Belgium, in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, Flanders, and they're all over the place there. There's the St. Jan's Cathedral in the town called Den Bosch, Schertogenbosch in Holland, that has them all over. There are big carvings of them on the arches, which look very similar to some of the ones you see in Suffolk. And they appear on coats of arms, and in the town of Schertogenbosch, they used to have a parade where people would parade dressed as wild men, because they believed that the inhabitants of the town before it was settled were wild men who lived in the woods.
Yeah.
This is probably just because of a local place name, because the name means the Duke's Woods. And as I say, a lot of coats of arms in southern Holland and Belgium feature these wild men.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of particularly Flemish and then Dutch immigrants who came to East Anglia, and it seems that they just brought this cultural icon with them. And a lot of the people carving the churches were from Flanders. I mean, there probably weren't a great deal of stone carvers around because there wasn't a great deal of stone.
Yes.
So there were these itinerant, we think, Flemish stone carvers who would just carve all these. And some of the figures of wild men, I mean, often they've got clubs. Usually they're just standing up straight because that's what fits into the shape of a font.
Yes.
Sometimes they got little shields, which are these little contemporary, what they call targets, which are these tiny shields that swordsmen or bowmen would have for self-defense if they needed them.
Yeah.
And they've got a club, and sometimes they're in this relaxed, cross-legged pose, one or two of them looking thoughtful with their hand on their chin. But some of them look like they're actual people, that they're almost caricatures of people. And it's thought that these itinerant, precarious stone carvers who led a bit of a wild existence themselves were doing caricatures of themselves or each other. So the mystery, such as it is, it just seems to be a cultural import that was brought by immigrants from the Netherlands and Belgium to that particular part of the world.
There's no connection between Woodwoses and the Green Man.
The Green Man, as far as I can see, or a foliate head, to give it its correct term, seems to have been just a kind of architectural flourish that developed around that time when, again, there was a lot of church building going on. And it was in a way of demonstrating what they could do, because there was this particular kind of vaulted ceiling that was starting then, and it was just a flourish that you did at the top of the vault. And I think this idea that it represents some kind of long-dead pagan survival, it's probably made up by Victorian antiquarians who made up a lot of stuff. And it has taken hold, because it's a nice idea. But I think the idea of what appear to be non-Christian representations of fantastic animals in churches as being something that's not Christian is a kind of Protestant idea that's taken off after the Reformation, when the idea was going back to what was in the Bible. But to a churchgoer of that time, they wouldn't have understood what the problem was. The church was the cultural hub of the community, where they'd show off, art, culture. There would be competition among the wealthier people to pay for art or sculpture or representations. And they wouldn't have had any problem at all with wild men appearing. It would have been some sort of source of local pride to them. I mean, there were iconoclasts who went round in the time of Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans in the 1640s who damaged or destroyed a lot of church fittings, and they did deface some of these Woodwoses, but they generally left them alone because they weren't Catholic. They might not appear particularly Christian to us, but they were after representations of priests, of bishops, of the Virgin Mary, of the initials of the Virgin Mary. They didn't like stained glass windows, but as I say, they left these alone because at least they weren't Catholic. So I don't think there's any kind of indication of any survival of some pagan religion, because they wouldn't have understood that things in churches had to be necessarily connected to the Bible even.
Yeah. What other, conscious times moving on, what other wild, mysterious animals, cryptids have you heard of or encountered? Well, not encountered, but investigated in this part of the world, Suffolk?
There's a cluster of fairies around a town called Stowmarket, which is in the middle of the county, which is, otherwise unexceptional.
Yeah.
But for some reason, there were a lot of sightings of fairies. From medieval chronicles mention them. And there was the story of what's called the Green Children of Woolpit. There's a local village where it is said that these two children turned up with green skin, which eventually faded to a normal colour, speaking a strange language. The boy refused to eat and died, and the girl thrived and grew up and married a local nobleman and became respectable. There's also a story about a disembodied fairy called Malakin in a local village who appeared to speak and was briefly seen by certain people who claimed to have been a changeling, a child who was seized from a human family and became a fairy. All sorts of reports of fairies trying to steal children, and there was a street in the town of Stowmarket called Tavern Street where if you hid behind piles of wood, which you could find in urban streets those days, you could catch a glimpse of them, and if you ran after them, they'd run away, leaving trails of sparks. And there was also an encounter just outside the town in the field of hops by a man who, by moonlight, saw a fairy circle, circles dancing silently. The reason why that survives is there was a man called the Reverend Hollingsworth who in 1840 wrote a history of Stowmarket. He was a local vicar. Yeah. He wrote the history of Stowmarket. And all the informants about fairy sightings are anonymised, interestingly. They didn't want to give their names. But they were very old people. They were in their 80s, so they were describing events from their childhood, which must have been at the end of the 18th century. Mm-hmm. So the survival of fairy stories is mostly down to the Reverend Hollingsworth. But there have been more recent stories of fairies. For example, there was a man in 1920 when he was a boy in a town called Saxmundham, which is a county town with a station. And he thought he was seeing ghosts. He described them as ghosts dancing, all dressed in white, dancing in a circle. And there are numerous fairy stories, most of them from about 1800 that the local newspaper, the Ipswich Journal, reported them. There was a strange encounter with something like a fairy which popped out of a trapdoor in the bottom of a railway carriage in a train that was going past Hawley Junction, Suffolk. Other than that, there have been odd sightings of sea serpents, particularly around Kessingland, which is a village, a holiday village near Lowestoft in the north of the county. And there was something called the Waveney Monster, which was a long thing with a head like a moose that was seen swimming in the Waveney River, which separates Norfolk and Suffolk, and that was in the 1970s. And there's also a series of inexplicable lights, mystery lights, some of which appear to move as if they're intelligent, and there's long been stories about people being led astray, often into dangerous marshes, by these lights who are known as will-o'-the-wisps. But there have been some more recent encounters with them as well. And a lot of the testimony from the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident of 1980, when US servicemen report chasing these lights around the forest that bobbed around and disappeared and shot around very quickly. They're consistent not so much with a UFO story, but with these stories of mystery lights that have been reported for a long time along the coasts and in the marshes around that area.
Right. Hyper sprites or hyper sprites?
The hyper sprites are in Norfolk. Most of the creatures that are reported in Suffolk, they have scarier versions in Norfolk. The hyper sprites seem to wear white in Norfolk, whereas in Suffolk it's traditionally greens and reds that they wear.
Yeah.
Although there was this report from Saxmundham I mentioned about this silent circle of what they described as ghosts dancing, which are more consistent with fairy reports coming from about 1920.
What, I always like to ask this, what originally piqued your interest in this? I mean, you know, you mentioned earlier on you're a journalist, but this is quite a fringe area.
Yeah.
What got you into writing about it and researching it? Was it a personal experience, or?
I haven't had any strange encounters myself. I mean, I've had some encounters with animals which I've been able to very quickly work out what they were. Like that, there was something that shot past in Dunwich Forest, which is just a big fox.
Yeah.
Other people have reported it. And I did think I saw a black leopard from a train going through Suffolk in a field until I went past in the other direction later that day, and it was still there, and it was a blackened tree stump.
Yeah.
My mother did zoology at university. She was one of the first sort of mass intake of women into the life sciences in the 50s. So when it was half term, she always took me to the Natural History Museum. And I think that's probably where it started.
Okay, I know we're in lockdown at the moment, and I know you're working on finishing your book, but have you got any projects planned for when you can escape and get out into the wild world again?
Obviously finishing off Mystery Animals of the British Isles, Suffolk, but I think the big cats element of that lends itself to taking a wider look at East Anglia, because there's a lot going on in Norfolk. As with the fairies and Black Shuck, Norfolk has bigger and scarier versions of big cats. There's a Norfolk Gnasher, which has been the subject of several parliamentary questions from one of the Norfolk MPs who was concerned about its effect on livestock. Also in Cambridgeshire, there's a lot going on. I mean, East Anglia is generally regarded as Suffolk, Norfolk to the north, and then Cambridgeshire to the west. Some people include Essex. And Essex goes right up to the suburbs of London, but you get, even in what's effectively the suburbs of London, you get these reports of big cats. For example, there's something in Malden, which, I mean, it's almost on the London Underground. And there's supposed to be some kind of mysterious black lynx in Malden. And in order to have big cat sightings, you need to have people. And Suffolk doesn't have that many sightings because it doesn't have that many people to have sightings. You know, it's probably a good place for big cats to hide, but there aren't many people around. Whereas Essex is a bit more populated, so you do get more sightings, some surprisingly urban ones. And as I say, Cambridgeshire's got something very interesting going on, what's called the fen tiger, although it's not actually a tiger. It's called the fen tiger because when the Dutch engineers started draining the Cambridgeshire fens, they were resisted tenaciously by the locals, and they got the name fen tiger because of that. So the fen tigers are actually people. But it's the name confusingly given to some big cat, which seems to be several different big cats with a lot of different appearances. And there's also some sort of ocelot-type cat reported in Cambridgeshire as well. And, I mean, it's clear from the reports I get that big cats are no respecters of county boundaries, and they're moving around a lot.
Yes.
So I'd like to investigate that a bit more, concentrating just on the big cats, which, as I say, are probably flesh and blood animals. There are some exciting developments that I can't talk about at the moment with regard to big cats, but all I can say is watch this space.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on then. So, Matt Salusbury, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Now, Matt Salusbury, who we just heard just now, in his interview, made a reference to the Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk, the scene of the UK's most famous UFO incident in 1980. And, weirdly, appropriate enough for this show, we also have a connection between Rendlesham Forest, cryptozoology, and the game of Pokemon. Yes, Apparently, on Pokemon Day this year, which took place on the 27th of February, I know, who knew there was such an event on the calendar, it was announced that a new creature, the Zoruda, would be entering the Pokemon universe. Also known as the Rogue Monkey, Pokemon bloggers were quick to suggest the Zoruda might be related to a creature in English folklore known as the Shug Monkey, a creature some eyewitnesses reported seeing in Rendlesham Forest in the 1950s. But there's more. Let's look at the legend of the Shug Monkey in more detail. The word shug is believed to come from either the Old English term skuka, meaning demon, or a centuries-old local term shucky, which means hairy or shaggy, and is where East Anglia's famous black dog, Black Shuck, takes its name. Now, according to the folklore of Cambridgeshire, and Cambridgeshire is the next door county to Suffolk, so for any critters wandering around, it's not very far for them to go over the county boundary. The Shug Monkey is described as a creature that shares features of a dog and a monkey, and reportedly haunted the Slough Hill Lane area, which is a street that leads from the village of West Ratting to nearby Barsham. The creature, said to have a body of a jet black shaggy sheepdog and the face of a monkey with staring eyes, was believed to be a supernatural ghost or demon. Local writer and broadcaster James Wentworth Day first related stories of the Shug Monkey in Here Are Ghosts and Witches, a book published in 1954. And according to local police constable A. Taylor, we don't know his first name, Albert maybe, let's call him Albert Taylor, who recounted the story to Wentworth Day. He said, when he was young, the Shug Monkey was known to be a cross between a big rough-coated dog and a monkey with big shining eyes. Sometimes it would shuffle along on its hind legs, and at other times it would whiz past on all fours. Constable Taylor also stated that after dark, local children at that time avoided its haunt on Slough Hill, which was then an overgrown and little-used lane. According to folklorist Polly Howard, who specialises in the Cambridgeshire area, she says sightings of the Shug Monkey have not been reported since before World War II, so you're looking about 1939. Although that doesn't explain the apparent sighting of the Shug Monkey in Rendlesham Forest in the 1950s. So, if you're travelling to East Anglia and you see what looks to be a very large monkey that might also be a dog, say hello to Shug Monkey.
Good day, gentlefolk. I doth have breaking news. Your Weird Tales host, Charles Christian, has written a new book called Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. 5 shocking true tales that are stranger than fiction. There's murder, mayhem, treason, incest, adultery, and worse. Read about the real antics of 9 saints. Yes, saints. 8 kings and 5 queens of England, plus the wickedest of all stepmothers. And be amazed, or horrified, or appalled, or all 3. If you love weird history, and methinks you do, hop over to Amazon for your copy of Charles Christian's Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. Grab yours now.
Let's have another of our creature features. And this week we meet the Pesta, an ominous creature from the old Norse lands of Norway, Sweden and Finland. Although the Pesta can be traced back to the mid-14th century, she still remains eerily relevant today in these days of the coronavirus pandemic, for she is the plague witch or plague demon of Scandinavian folklore. The Pesta is consistently described as a terrible old ashen-faced woman, usually wearing a red skirt, who makes her way from village to village, bringing death in her wake. She always carries with her a broomstick and a rake. If you encounter the Pesta with her rake, then you can take comfort from the fact that some of your community will survive by escaping through the tines of the rake. However, if you see her sweeping with her broom, then you're all doomed and will be swept away by the plague and pestilence. Other aspects of the Pesta legend include tales of her being accompanied on her travels by rats, and that she carries with her a large book in which are written the names of all the people doomed to die within the coming months. What is intriguing is the way the Pesta embodies the way the Black Death, or bubonic plague, actually did spread throughout Scandinavia, and not just Scandinavia but the rest of Europe in the middle years of the 14th century. With no scientific understanding of how the Yersinia pestis bacterium exists in the fleas that are carried by rats, people look for supernatural explanations for why death apparently mysteriously moved from community to community, afflicting both rich and poor alike, in some instances killing everyone. In a particular village, the mortality rate in Scandinavia was around 60%, with the dead outnumbering the living by a ratio of 3 to 2, but in other places leaving them relatively unscathed. In other words, it was the broom and it was the rake. Legends of Pesta also describe her travelling from place to place by ship, which again eerily echoes the reality of the Black Death, as in medieval Europe, boat trips across seas and along rivers and over lakes were a popular means of travel at a time when roads were dangerous muddy tracks haunted by bandits. And of course, all boats have rats in their hulls, and rats carrying plague-infected fleas. Indeed, the Black Death actually arrived in Europe in January 1348 on merchant ships docking at the ports of Genoa and Venice. We owe our current knowledge of the Pesta to the Norwegian priest, folklorist and historian Andreas Fay, who in 1833 published a collection of legends and folk tales handed down from generation to generation by traditional Norwegian hunting and farming communities. However, our most abiding images of the Pesta are those painted by the Norwegian artist Theodor Kittelsen in the final years of the 19th century. Google Theodor Kittelsen, Kittelsen, and you'll find some very scary images of the Pesta and her rake. It'll be interesting to see in the decades and centuries to come how folk tales will depict, explain and or blame the spread of the great COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic of 2020. Perhaps for burning 5G radio towers and crates of Corona beer. Anyway, next time we have one of our creature features, I promise it'll be something cheery and exotic and fabulous and fun. And that's it. We're almost out of time. However, let's just squeeze in one final story. Now, over here in the UK, we're still on fairly serious lockdown with zero prospect of pubs, clubs, wine bars and other drinking establishments reopening for business anytime soon now. So Janie and I were discussing some of the wine bars we used to frequent back in the days when we lived in London. There was Brahms and Liszt in Covent Garden. Brahms and Liszt is Cockney rhyming slang for being drunk. Think about it. Anyway, that place is long gone, as is the slogan that used to be over the bar that said, "If the music's too loud, you're too old." Then there was a wine bar in Soho Square, now also gone, and probably the scene of me having more expense account liquid lunches than was good for me during the 1970s and early 1980s. However, just over 300 years ago, a house in that same location, Soho Square, was the scene of an unusual haunting. Here's the tale. The year was 1704, and the owner of the house lived in a part of it, while the rest of it was let out as furnished lodgings. And at the time, the current lodger seemed to be a wealthy man, and his 2 servants. So the landlord was very happy. Anyway, one day the man told the landlord that his brother had sadly died and asked whether the brother's coffin could be kept in the house overnight before being taken to the family vault the following day. The landlord naturally agreed, and so the coffin and its body was laid out on the dining room table, which may seem a bit odd by modern standards, but that's what people used to do right through until the early part of the 20th century. Anyway, later that same night, a servant girl, who was by then the only person still up and about, was horrified to see a tall figure, deathly pale and wrapped in a shroud, enter the kitchen, which is where she was working. Not surprisingly, she fled upstairs to rouse her master and mistress, that's the landlord and landlady, only to find that the spectre followed her into their bedroom, where it seated itself by the door, glaring and grimacing at her. Simultaneously, the house was filled with a clattering and a crashing. The servant girl, not too surprisingly, fainted, while the landlord and his wife cowered beneath the bedclothes. After a long while, the noises stopped. The ghost had gone. Phew, relief all round. Well, not quite, but along with the ghost disappearing, so had a great deal of the silverware and other valuables in the house. It turned out that the ghost was in fact a notorious robber whose accomplices had smuggled him into the house in the coffin, so he could take the part of the spectre while they could plunder the house undisturbed, and in so doing load all their booty into the coffin and carry it off with them. So, Soho Square. Possibly not a place you want to go and rent. Now it just remains for me, Charles Christian, to say thank you very much for listening in, and I'll hope you'll join me again same time next week. Till then, stay well, stay weird, stay different. Good night.
Black Shug, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.